Welcome to week 4, Aboriginal and Culturally Responsive Pedagogies. This week we're going to be looking at delivering and developing 8 ways pedagogies, and in particular we're going to look at land-based education through a number of Sydney Aboriginal sites that may or may not be familiar to you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, as well as elders past, present and emerging, for sharing their knowledge with me and with us around the Aboriginal sites that we're going to be talking about in this lecture. This is also a lovely little video if you get time to watch a primary school, actually enacting practice and giving acknowledgement at the beginning of a day's learning. So today we're going to be looking at a lot of historical knowledge and understanding where it fits in through a range of Aboriginal sites, in particular Berry Island and some others that we'll look at examples from. Remembering that this unit is about unlearning and then relearning some of those past ways of doing education, and that land-based education is somewhat a new way of incorporating it into a Western classroom context. I want us to also remember that when we did our week 2 activity, we looked at middens, and I said to you during that tutorial that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and many of the Sydney Aboriginal site visits that you might now take yourself on will be those very sites that have often had their histories and their knowledge erased or hidden, and are very difficult to uncover. The Australian curriculum and the shape of Australian history talks about contestation and contestability, and that students need to be able to deal with alternative accounts of Australia's past, because these enter into the public debate often. So it's an important part of developing critical and creative thought with students. When we look at Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal systems coming together, we look at what is the historical significance of that for students, staff and community. And these dot points talk about many of the beneficial reasons why we would be looking at land-based education, but particularly Aboriginal education, in a much more holistic way when we're including it in our teaching and learning cycles. This is a really important concept when we're looking at our teaching and learning cycles, and that is that of subject and content mastery. And many of you will struggle with this in your initial first pracs, because you'll realise that there are a range of content areas that you haven't studied at university in your undergraduate degrees, but nor have you explored those in any depth when you are undertaking curriculum units. And then there are, of course, those other mastery components which require initial teacher education students to also have all of the skills related to the teaching, for example, of historical understanding, also geography, which we will be doing this week in our tutorials, mathematics, the humanities all have content mastery skills, the arts and also the applied sciences. So it's important that you see your careers and your content subject mastery as a work in progress, but also that these will be some of the largest challenges to your teaching success in those first early years. So now I'd like to move on to some of the big ideas, particularly those related to land-based education and thinking of land-based education from an Aboriginal worldview. And what does it mean to think of land as a source of knowledge and understanding? How do our relationships with land inform and order the way humans conduct relationships with one another, other than human beings? How do we offer education to people on the land in the ways that are grounded for Indigenous knowledges? What does it mean to understand land as a system of reciprocal social relationships and ethical practices as a framework for decolonial critique? And these are only a few of the central questions that the materials raise, but these are the sorts of things that are important to also explore with your students, as land as being a very rich source of education. So when we're using this land-based education, we're also thinking and using what we call in this unit the 8 Ways framework. And the boomerang is where our Aboriginal knowledge, coupled with our non-Aboriginal knowledge and our content mastery, work together to find some common ground and innovation. And in that space, we call that at the peak of the boomerang, the cultural interface. So we are beginning perhaps at a low point of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal knowledges. And as we bring those knowledges together, for ourselves and for our learners, we are developing a cultural interface or common ground, but also spaces for innovation and understanding about what it is to be Aboriginal, but also why land is such an important concept. The 8 Ways pedagogy was developed in Western New South Wales, but documented by a gentleman by the name of Tyson Yunkaporta. And it has 8 key symbols and key ideas about how we present knowledge to students in interconnected ways, and using things like quality teaching in the same way as we would in a standard classroom, but also make sure that students are very aware of the processes they should be undertaking in their thinking at any one particular point in a lesson. Many lessons, of course, start with this top story sharing or the boomerang symbol and our community links. And it's really important that we make real connections to our land-based sites and our community links. We also may have very many non-verbal symbols and icons and images that are helping us understand these larger concepts of Aboriginal land-based education. And of course, we have specific land links, and they are sometimes our absolute Aboriginal land sites, but they could be also our land links through key pieces of the environment. Often we have to take our learners on a journey which is sometimes non-linear, but also takes them through a pathway that deconstructs and then reconstructs their learning. And these are very similar to activities we would do in a classroom, but we would perhaps call deconstruct, reconstruct, think, pair, share. It's not to say it's as simple as think, pair, share, but it is one of those very similar conceptual understandings of teaching language that we use in the classroom. Of course, quality teaching becomes a major framework for the work that Yunka Porter and the 8 Ways framework also embeds in the way in which we teach, starting with the stories, background knowledge, cultural knowledge, and substantive communications at the front of a lesson or a front of a unit of work, creating a level of connectedness. And not every lesson has all of these components at the front, but every lesson should have at least one of those. That gives us a connection to problematic knowledge, where students are then helping themselves and each other to develop deeper knowledge. They create social support. They develop an understanding of meta language or the key terminologies used in their topic areas. Some more deep understanding, perhaps, around how those terms make further meaning for them in their learning. Develop some self-direction and self-regulation, so students are supporting themselves and others. It develops things like higher order thinking at the end, where students can talk about other connections they are now recognizing in their environments, which creates an endpoint which may be knowledge integration, high expectations, explicit criteria that you, the teacher, may be exuding to the students, and engagement. These are, of course, very brief overviews, and I suggest that you read a little bit more about 8 Ways through reading Yunka Porter's work, so that you really understand in an authentic way what 8 Ways is really about. When we're looking at 8 Ways, we're looking also at interesting ways that we can start the lesson, and I often call this as using the hooks. So what are the strong narrative, background knowledge, cultural knowledge, substantive communication, symbols and icons? How can we do this without words sometimes? So when we did our activity in week 2, we of course made our oyster shells. So what are the sorts of things that you may make or may use from a land-based education site that helps us to engage the learner, making sure that we're not removing objects, but it could be something like a sound bite. So we don't want to infringe cultural protocols, but we also want to make sure that the learners get as much contact with those objects. And of course, in a non-COVID world, we would like to be visiting those sites, for example, like Berry Island that we're going to have a look at the moment. Make sure that when you're creating lessons or, creating learning in your practicums, that you are creating an authentic story, that you're taking time to think about how this story links to the larger story and the content that you're trying to get students to unpack for themselves, and make sure that there's enough instructions that the students really understand the expectations and the products that they have to produce at the end of a lesson. So when we're looking at also Aboriginal ways of knowing, I want to look particularly today at the way in which Western knowledge consumers look at Aboriginal science, and the way in which they create terms for the way in which we look at our scientific understandings of our worlds. So these often include Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous environmental knowledge, traditional ecological or traditional environmental knowledge. So IK, IEK, TK and TEK. So these are roughly interconnected definitions. They're used sometimes in science to explain the way in which others interpret the knowledge that we are conveying to them, because they always love to interpret science as separate and not whole, and possibly it gives them a greater understanding into Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies. And this is perhaps one of the key reasons that the sciences are largely avoiding the embedding of Aboriginal ways of knowing into their classrooms. And that comes from limited engagement with Aboriginal stories and the scientific ways in which Aboriginal people know science. These are important because as future teachers, we have to be able to articulate what it is we do in our classrooms and how we've learnt and understood examples like IK, IEK, TK, and TEK into our professional standards. And what is it other than 1.4 and 2.4 that we can include depending on the activities we generate. But we can take ourselves on many of these site visits, but better still is to engage with those site explorations with Aboriginal knowledge holders who hold the knowledge or entrusted the knowledge to share with the wider community. So again, I want us to think about, our Aboriginal ways of knowing, in that we've got those three spheres: the human world, the physical world, and the sacred world, and how knowing land, which is central to this diagram, helps us to unpack the interrelationships of all of our human world, physical world, and sacred worlds. So these are really very, very complex ways of knowing. And it's not that we expect teachers to know the level of detail within Aboriginal family groups and the ceremonies, etc. But it's that we share with you particularly the links between the physical world and land, animals, sky, and how those stories are also linked through the sacred world. The human world, the families and family ownership, of course, are very important, particularly when we're looking at community consultation. So just a little bit of a background about Eight Ways and where it began. It began in Western New South Wales, and it began in communities like the Barkindji, the Nyampa, the Wallarai, the Gamilarai, the Wiradjuri, the Warramunga, whose knowledges the framework actually shares. However, what we are doing is using that framework on Western New South Wales's, well, we're using the Western New South Wales framework, and we're using it on the authentic stories of the country. So we're using it as a model when we're using and helping students understand Durek, Dharawal, Gadigal, and others. Stories of the Sydney region or further afield, particularly those of you who might be doing a practicum too in rural settings. So we need to honour that pedagogy and the stories that come with those pedagogies. But we also need to be very mindful that when we're teaching these stories and sharing them with students, that we also are using the stories of the country in which the school is located. And by that I mean we are not using stories from the Northern Territory in our classrooms here in Western Sydney. That makes no sense, and it is offensive to those communities like the Dharawal and Guringai, the Gadigal, who have their own stories, and they are the stories of the Sydney peoples. So it's important that we try to the best of our capacity to learn about some of those stories. Of course, there are other sites where we have multiple stories, and those sites are places like the Australian Museum, and they are cultural repositories of multiple stories. And that would be the example where we would use um, and engage students with the stories of multiple communities. But that is also the very time where we're looking at the eight ways symbol of synthesize, and we're also looking at the deconstruct, reconstruct symbol in our learning to make sure that students understand that this is perhaps not from this area, but it is from connected areas or connected stories. So many of you have started the essay, and you're also exploring the role of elders in this work. And in many of the readings that have been suggested to you, elders often express the desire to have other kinds of learning happen, and we often call that working two ways or working both ways. And Purdy Millgate Bell and the Perso readings also talk about the role of elders and what roles they play in the both way learning process. But it also highlights that entering other communities and country requires us as institutions, and that's as institutions, as educational settings, as schools, to do no further harm to communities who are already feeling vulnerable. So don't enter without understanding their school context, the national curriculum, um, things like in the Territory, the first 4 hours of English, and we hear elders quoting, "Come and meet us halfway. You will learn a lot about us for who we are. This will help you teach our children in a real way. It will help you at school. It will help you in the classroom. It will help you become wise. It will help you build strong respect towards us and towards yourself. The way teaching Aboriginal children will start to become clearer, clearer, and clearer if you are willing to meet us halfway with an open mind and open heart." So these are some of the key principles that elders particularly want to see being included, and that's walking into the school and into the learning and meeting us halfway, not being the dominant only way of expressing education and content. So one of the most important things to learn in this is that professional learning is very, very limited, and the Corft article online has reminded us that um, a recent survey about the key needs of teachers working in Aboriginal education stated that only 23.9% had had more than one day of training around Aboriginal education in the last 3 years. So that's a fairly limited amount of training, specifically when we're looking at Western Sydney and we're looking at high numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners. These things are really important because ACARA, of course, expect that all teachers will be able to deliver experiences around country and place, culture and people. And this is part of their agenda in moving forward to create opportunities for reconciliation. But many schools and individuals are very unaware or very fearful of being able to teach all of those domains and those dot points um, appropriately and respectfully in their schools. And that's not surprising with the Corf reminder about how few of them had more than 1 day of training in the last 3 years. And that is a significant number of teachers working in the environment who haven't had any update or further training around working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners since things like the national curriculum, the Australian curriculum was put into place, but also that the professional standards and what they actually mean to individual teachers trying to accredit themselves and stay um, authentic to the standards being upheld. That being said, now we're going to move on to looking at how this week we can look at STEM and the various ways in which STEM curriculum is available to students in schools. And what are the sorts of strands, given that many of you unfortunately believe that you will only ever be teaching the strands that you are trained in, and that may well not be the case. So in science, of course, we got science 7 to 10. In the technology strands and the engineering strands, you can see that we have many different syllabus documents. In mathematics, as like science, we just have the single syllabus. However, when we move into some of the more elective areas, we certainly see agricultural technology. And for those coastal schools, we see 7 to 10 marine and aquaculture technology. So there are many opportunities to include Aboriginal communities, but also to include Aboriginal ways of knowing. So looking at those syllabuses, we're going to now look at two sites, well, one site in particular, and the Red Hands Cave has many examples on the views site that you can have a look at. But we're going to have a look at Berry Island because Berry Island will be the site we are looking at in terms of geography and science and tools, technology, engineering, and what are the sorts of things that we can discuss as teachers trying to use an Aboriginal site as a land-based education experience. So Berry Island, we might first make contact with Karen Smith, who's the Aboriginal Heritage Officer, and she works off Gamaragal country. But you also might contact Auntie Jean South, of course, Elder in Residence, and of course, as somebody who has visited and documented this site many times, you might also come and contact me. There are in science so many opportunities: Australian ecosystems, food chains, producers, consumers, human activities, microorganisms, tools for technology. There is grinding grooves there, middens, fish hooks. In engineering, of course, there's how do we protect these sites. In mathematics, there are mapping exercises and GPS exercises we could undertake. We can also use PDHPE and Fitbits, tracking steps, heart rates, etc., etc. And in the arts, of course, we can do botanical drawing and various other things. So this is kind of what it might look like in terms of what are the educational opportunities at this one particular site. So food web, it was the science, the engineering, technology, maths. Um, so all areas of STEM. But of course, we just looked at it in terms of STEAM. So STEAM is when we add the arts, and STEM is when we just have the regular 4 aspects. So let's move on to science and the living world in stage 5, and we see what students are required to do, and they can construct and interpret food chains, food webs, including examples from Australian ecosystems. And this is really important because we are teaching an Australian curriculum, and those explicit messages to teachers about those examples from Australian ecosystems are really important. That means that we should not be borrowing things off the internet that are not from Australia, because they actually want Australian curriculum to develop Australian scientific knowledge for students. And so again, if we look at D in the living world, predict how human activities can affect interactions in food chains, including examples from Australian land or marine ecosystems. And when we look at Berry Island, and if we took students to Berry Island, we would find that there are many human activities, including boating and a local oil refinery being right close by the interactions and food chains and food webs that are already there at Berry Island, and we can see damage to the marine ecosystems, particularly the oysters on the rocks, which show signs of damage due to chemical spills, etc. So these are really important ways that we can talk then about dot point F, where we're talking about improving yields and sustainability and the other things that are important in that area. So when we're looking for opportunities to teach a unit of work or a particular topic area, we need to look at what we're being asked to teach with those students, and that says LW5 requires science and technology to contribute to finding solutions to conserving and managing sustainable ecosystems. And those sustainable ecosystems include those which have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander focus. So the one at Berry Island with Karen Smith and the Heritage Office would be an ideal opportunity for you to explore that. How would we go about doing that? As a research task, we would get students to look at all the possible plants and animals and then develop an example of a food web showing the effects of British invasion on the local ecosystem, but also to make this even better and to understand the 8 ways cycle and synthesize, we would add the visual cues of each of those animals that we would be talking about and make it a very complete food web example. We're very lucky in the science area because ACARA have given us a whole range of connections where in science the knowledge about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land-based education can be seen. But if we, like I said last week in tutorial, if we only look at it from the perspective of science, that's all we'll see. And if we unlearn the way we're learning about things, we can also see that within those statements on the science elaborations, there are also opportunities for business studies to be discussed. There's also opportunities for geography, scientific investigations, of course, mathematical information, and also PDHPE around seasonal patterns, food sources, dietary requirements are all opportunities that can be seen in that area. Berry Island, depending on any one time we go to the site, has a range of botanical or scientific ecosystems that we can look at, but also that students can document and then find scientific names about their ecosystems post the site visit. So these are really important things when we're talking about the land links, but also deconstruct and reconstruct, where students have taken a photograph and then they have to re-research that using a range of sites. The Australian curriculum also requires us as teachers to help students engage with the general capabilities, and those general capabilities are things like critical and creative thinking, ethical understanding. So why don't we walk on the rock engravings? What are the sorts of things that we can do to preserve those rock engravings? What is the signage that's required? Information and communication technology and capabilities, using Google Earth to look at Berry Island from above, intercultural understanding, how does the site operate today? Literacy, numeracy, and personal and social capabilities are all areas that we as teachers have to plan for, which are outside of our curriculum documents. So these are really important things for us to consider when we're trying to plan our teaching through land-based education. So in terms of your own professional learning in this space, there are many other opportunities that you can go and have a look at the Australian Curriculum website that will give you some ideas about how different schools have approached their two-way teaching of science, for example, in their communities, and it may give you ideas of how we might also then use those same principles in a Western Sydney context. For example, the Gordon Vale example talks about fire and fire burning off, and that has a direct link to things that we might look at when we are looking at the Red Hands Cave example in Glenbrook in New South Wales up the Blue Mountains. We're also required to look at our curriculum areas through 3 cross-curriculum priority areas. And of course, this unit is totally focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, but there are also opportunities to embed that directly with things like sustainability at cross-curriculum priority area, where we can see geography, science and maths, and the graphic of this article and how global warming is hitting Indigenous people the most, and what species of animal it's having a particular impact upon. And these are really high order thinking, so raising those expectations and getting students to read much more complex graphs. When we're doing our teaching, it's important to model good um, content linkages, and some of those will of course be specific Aboriginal links, but also we need to model also the British contact links. And here in these examples, we've got commerce, geography, TAS, history and business studies examples that might be useful for you to understand and unpack as part of your own professional learning in your own curriculum areas. When we look at curriculum areas like English, however, and country, we might also then look at the storytelling and the comparative storytelling of poets. And this, of course, is Dorothea McKellar, who's written about my country. The most significant stanza, perhaps, that many of you may have interacted with is I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons, I love her jeweled sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. And of course, then we have on the right hand side the artist talking about the wide brown land and having a sculptural piece on sitting on that wide brown land. But of course, the lesser known paragraph, the first stanza of that poem, is perhaps the lesser known, but also very important to our understanding of non-Aboriginal people's connection to country as well during these same periods. We might also then read the poem, which is the story, and then try and synthesize some of that information with our students around Dorothea's life, where she was situated, showing actual maps of the Hunter Valley, and where she was living near Gunnedah, and other key important things about her life and how that life gave her such a particular connection to country as well. It's important that, when you're out on prac, these lesson plans for English and history and other areas really understand some of the key strategies that you should be using, and you might mention those when you're undertaking your assessment tasks. Some of the lead up activities might be joint construction. There is definitely skills in mastery required by many of you in terms of the 4 stages in action of getting students to prepare for reading, detailed reading, note making, and joint construction. And more information can be found through the NESA website for you. When we're looking at mathematics, there are also some very key stages in action in terms of what we are doing in our maths classrooms. Teacher modelling, first guided practice, second guided practice, and joint construction. All of you who are in mathematics strands should be reading a little bit more about those kinds of focuses on numeracy and how you will become or develop more mastery in the way in which you're approaching your lessons, and particularly how students need guidance in undertaking numeracy tasks. So these are all also available on the NESA site, so the links are there. Of course, there's also other support structures that can help us, and we've got lots of support structures if you're going to work in the DET, and they are Brawongle's Earth and Environmental Ed Centre, and there's also other earth and environmental ed centres around Sydney that you might engage with, and many of those also now have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs attached to them, and professional learning. And of course, this one also then has a synthesis story, a disconnect or a deconstruct, reconstruct story around the platypus or jubbins, the platypus. So these are ways in which you can embed not only the scientific knowledge but the dreaming story that go with particular animals in our communities. So 8 Ways belongs to a place. I want us to remember, not a person or an organisation. It did come from Western New South Wales. It did come from those communities, the Bakunji, the Nyimpa, the Yallara, Gamilarey, Wiradjuri and Wakamara. And of course, that if we are working with those stories, we need to learn those stories, but we also need to learn the stories from our communities in Direct, Dharawal and Gadigal and others, and how those stories need to be respected by us as future educators. We need to be very mindful of protocols. Um, Protocols are very difficult. They're difficult to maintain relationships with communities, and they're difficult to learn. Sometimes, we do get ourselves into trouble, and even I have had myself in a pickle sometimes. We must listen, and remembering week 1 we did Dadiri. We must listen to the land, to elders, to our Aboriginal community and other knowledge holders, and this takes time. It requires us to move outside our comfort zones as individuals and as teacher professionals. If we continue to have a closed mindset, then of course nothing will change in the Closing the Gap report, and to our data that we keep in classrooms, and that we need to adapt things like a growth mindset. There are some really supporting texts that you might want to engage with if and when you're ready. The text Nourishing Terrains, the link is there to Deborah Birdrose's work, and there are some fabulous connections to land and land-based education and to wilderness, and to various aunts and uncles, elders past and present, who talk about their experiences on land. Of course, there's also Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, Black Seeds, Agriculture or Accident. And then there's Nerita Blair's book, Privileging Australian Indigenous Knowledges, Sweet Potatoes, Spiders, Water Lilies and Brick Walls, talking about the institutions and how sometimes we can't break those brick walls down because of closed mindsets. There's also another text that might be useful, which is there's a book called Young Dark Emu, and very useful for lower level literacy, of the same kinds of text, but you might use it in the 7-8 classroom setting. So Young Dark Emu by, again, Bruce Pascoe, and the illustrations are by another lady, I can't remember exactly who. I'm very sorry. There are other things that you might want to look at. The Working with Aboriginal Communities document, looking at national parks and wildlife services and things you can do. Also, lots of free professional opportunities there to go on site visits with national parks officers. Also thinking about Murama, which is our Sydney Olympic Park engagement with Aboriginal youth, and also where to next. So what I would like you to do is take more time to now read about land-based education and your local areas. You know, knowing your own Aboriginal area locally is a very important part of your future teacher careers, because many of you will live and reside in those areas and choose to teach in those areas. So that's an important thing for you to understand, is your own local Aboriginal community. Um, how do you consult with that community in an authentic way? Is there a local AECG? All of those kinds of things become part of your where to next. And what may you incorporate into these ideas from today into your task two? And of course, we're going to be talking a little bit more about task two. So I do want you to watch the second video, which makes more links to local curriculum and resources you could use in your own development. But that's not a mandatory one right at this point. You might look at that at some other point. For tutorial this week, I would like you to download and print your Berry Island map. Make sure that you have your corrugated cardboard, glue, push pin, scissors, and printing the map ready for your tutorial. If you do not have your kit, you will be able to use any cardboard corrugated box that you can find. So my suggestion is that you find a corrugated cardboard box, and you take off a small section of that box and bring it inside so that you can undertake the task in the same way as your peers. Thank you, and I'll see you in tutorials this week.